For 44 years, a monster walked free. He had a badge. He had a family. He had neighbors who waved to him every morning. And he had a secret that would destroy hundreds of lives. He wasn't just a rapist. He wasn't just a murderer. He was both. And for 4 decades, he was invisible. Imagine this. You're sleeping in your home in Sacramento, California. It's 1976. You're safe. You're protected. The doors are locked. Your husband is beside you. Your children are down the hall. Then you hear it. A sound that doesn't belong. Footsteps. Not outside. Inside. Before you can scream, before you can move, before you can even understand what's happening, a voice cuts through the darkness. Shut up or I'll kill you. One move and everyone dies. This was the East Area Rapist, the man who would become the original Night Stalker, the predator who would terrorize California for over a decade, committing at least 50 rapes, 13 murders, and over 100 burglaries across 11 counties. But here's what makes this case extraordinary. Here's what changed everything. It wasn't a witness that caught him. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even traditional detective work. It was DNA, not from a criminal database, not from a law enforcement file, from a genealogy website, the kind your grandmother uses to find distant cousins. His name is Joseph James DeAngelo. For 23 years, he was your neighbor. He shopped at your grocery store. He lived on a quiet street in Citrus Heights, just miles from where he'd terrorized families 40 years earlier. And when they finally caught him, when they finally dragged this 72-year-old man out of his ordinary suburban home, he said something that would chill investigators to their core. I did all those things. I destroyed all those lives. This is the story of how one cold case changed criminal justice forever. How a retired patent attorney with a love for genealogy became the most feared weapon against cold case killers. How technology designed to unite families was turned into a tool to capture monsters. This is the story of the Golden State Killer. And this is the story of how they finally caught him. But first, we need to go back. Back to a small farming town in Central California. Back to 1974. Back to when the terror first began. Because to understand how he was caught, you need to understand what he did. And what he did was unthinkable. Coming up, a quiet neighborhood, a broken window, and a crime spree that would span over a decade and leave investigators with more questions than answers. But there was one thing they didn't know, one detail that would remain hidden for 40 years. The monster they were hunting was one of their own. Visalia, California, 1974. A small farming community in the Central Valley where everyone knew their neighbors, where doors stayed unlocked, where kids rode bikes until dark without a worry. It was the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. Until it did. It started small, almost laughable if it hadn't been so disturbing. Someone was breaking into homes while families were away, but this wasn't your typical burglar. He didn't want your television. He didn't want your jewelry. He didn't want anything of value. He wanted your memories. Between March 1974 and December 1975, over 100 homes in Visalia were ransacked by a prowler police called the Visalia Ransacker. He would pry open windows and doors, move through the house like a ghost, and take the strangest things. A single earring, a photograph, coins from a child's piggy bank, foreign currency from a drawer. And sometimes he would just stay. He'd eat food from the refrigerator, rummage through drawers, move items around, as if he was playing a game only he understood. But what terrified investigators most wasn't what he took, it was what he left behind. Warning items, dishes balanced against doors, bottles placed on handles. Like tripwires, like he expected someone to come home while he was still there. Like he wanted them to. For 18 months, the Visalia Ransacker remained a mystery, a nuisance, an oddity. The local police were baffled. Who breaks into over 100 homes and barely steals anything? But on September 11th, 1975, everything changed. 2 a.m., the Snelling residence on South Whitney Street. Claude Snelling, a 45-year-old journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias, was asleep with his wife, Arlene. Their 16-year-old daughter, Beth, was in her bedroom down the hall. Beth woke up to a weight on top of her. In the darkness, she thought it was one of her younger brothers playing a prank. Then she heard the voice. "Don't scream or I'll stab you to death." She saw the ski mask, the gun, the knife, and she realized with crushing horror that this wasn't a prank. The masked man dragged her from her bed, through the house, toward the back door. Beth could see her father's bedroom. She prayed he wouldn't wake up. She prayed he would. Claude Snelling heard a noise, something that didn't belong. He burst from his bedroom, through the kitchen, and confronted the masked intruder in the carport holding his daughter. The man shot him twice, once in the chest, once in the abdomen. Claude staggered back into the house to his wife. Minutes later, he was dead. The Visalia Ransacker had killed, and with that murder, a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. The gun used to kill Claude Snelling, stolen from another home just days earlier during one of the ransackings. The bicycle the killer used to escape, stolen from a nearby yard 2 days before the murder. He had been planning this. But here's something that would haunt investigators for decades. Something they wouldn't discover until 2018, 43 years later. At the time of Claude Snelling's murder, Joseph DeAngelo was a police officer in Exeter, California, just 12 miles away from Visalia. He attended the Kings County Public Safety Academy. That academy, it was held on the campus of the College of the Sequoias, the same campus where Claude Snelling taught. The Visalia Ransacker wasn't just some prowler. He was a cop, and he may have known his victim. 3 months after the murder in December 1975, Visalia police thought they finally had their break. An officer was staking out a home, watching from inside a darkened garage. He suspected the ransacker was casing the property. And then he saw him, a figure in the darkness, moving through a backyard. The officer confronted him. The man fired. The bullet struck the officer's flashlight, shattering it. The officer was unharmed, but the shooter vaulted a fence and vanished into the night. The officer got a good look at his face. Police created a composite sketch, a detailed one. White male, blonde or light brown hair, athletic build, mid-20s. But the Visalia Ransacker never struck Tulare County again. He didn't stop, he just moved. 6 months later, Sacramento County, June 1976. A new terror began. His pattern was the same, breaking and entering, prowling through homes, taking personal items. But now he wasn't just a burglar. He was a rapist. The first known attack occurred on June 18, 1976. Phyllis Henneman, 22 years old, was alone in her Sacramento home. Her mother had died just 18 months earlier. Her father was out of town. She woke to find a figure in her bedroom doorway, wearing a ski mask, holding a knife. He jumped onto her bed and pressed the 4-inch blade against her temple, creating a small cut near her eyebrow. He tied her up with cord he'd brought with him, and then he raped her. Phyllis Henneman became the first known victim of the East Area Rapist. But she wouldn't be the last. Over the next 2 years, from 1976 to 1978, the East Area Rapist would attack at least 51 women across Sacramento County and beyond. His victims ranged from 13 to 41 years old. Women alone, women with children, couples. His method became sickeningly predictable and impossibly terrifying. He would break in while his victims slept, pry open a window, pick a lock, move through the house in complete darkness, as if he knew the layout by heart. And he did, because he'd already been there. Investigators later discovered he would break into homes days or even weeks before an attack. He'd unlock windows, disable locks, map out escape routes, study his victims' schedules, learn when they were alone, when they were vulnerable. When he struck, he would shine a flashlight directly into their eyes, blinding them. Before they could scream, before they could even register what was happening, he'd press a knife to their throat. "Shut up or I'll kill you." If couples were home, he'd tie up the man first. binding his hands behind his back with shoelaces he brought with him. Then he'd do something that would become his signature, something that revealed the depth of his sadism. He'd stack dishes on the man's back, china plates, bowls, balanced precariously, and he'd lean close and whisper a threat. "If I hear those dishes rattle, I'll kill her. I'll kill everyone in this house." Then he'd take the woman to another room, and for hours, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, he would rape her, over and over, while her husband lay paralyzed with fear, barely breathing, listening to his wife's muffled cries, knowing that one movement, one mistake, meant death for everyone. Between assaults, he would ransack the house, eat food from the kitchen, drink beer from the refrigerator, make phone calls, as if he had all the time in the world, as if he owned them. Victim number 26, a woman later identified as Chris Pedretti, was 15 years old when he attacked her on December 18, 1976. She was home alone while her parents were at a Christmas party. She was playing piano when she heard it, footsteps behind her. Before she could turn, he had a knife to her throat. He said, "Do what I say or I'll kill you and be gone in the dark." That phrase, "gone in the dark," would later inspire writer Michelle McNamara's investigation into the case. Her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, published posthumously in 2018, would help bring renewed attention to the Golden State Killer just months before his arrest. But in 1976, there was no book, there was no hope, there was only terror. For over 2 hours, he raped Chris Pedretti 3 times. He would take her outside naked in the winter cold, then bring her back in. Over and over. A sick game. When he finally left, she was blindfolded, bound, and gagged, lying on a couch in front of a fireplace. She survived. But she would never be the same. The attacks continued. September 1976, October, November, December. By the beginning of 1977, East Sacramento was paralyzed with fear. People who had never locked their doors started installing deadbolts. Families slept with guns. Women traveled in groups. Community meetings were held. Police patrols increased. But nothing stopped him. In March 1977, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office received 3 phone calls in one afternoon, all from the same man. The first 2 were identical, laughing, mocking, hanging up. The third call was different.
Police department staff speaking. You're never gonna catch me, hysteria rapist, you dumb fuckers. I'm gonna fuck again tonight. Be careful.
I'm the East Side Rapist, and I have my next victim already stalked, and you guys can't catch me. That same day, attack number 15 occurred. The calls continued to police, to victims, taunting, threatening. In December 1977, the Sacramento Bee and the mayor's office received letters from someone claiming to be the East Area Rapist. One letter included a poem titled Excitement's Crave. It read, in part, Sacramento should make an offer to make a movie of my life that will pay for my planned exile. He was playing with them, all of them. But on February 2nd, 1978, the game changed again. Brian Maggiore, 21, was a military policeman at Mather Air Force Base. His wife, Katie, was 20. They were walking their dog in their Rancho Cordova neighborhood around 7 p.m. A quiet evening, a normal evening, until someone started chasing them. Brian was shot in the chest. As he fell, Katie ran. She screamed for help. She didn't make it far. He caught her, shot her in the head, left both bodies in a yard on La Gloria Drive. The East Area Rapist had graduated from rape to murder. The Maggiores had no enemies. They weren't targeted. They weren't involved in anything criminal. They were just 2 people walking their dog. They saw something they shouldn't have seen, or he thought they did, and for that, he executed them both. For 40 years, their murders would remain unsolved. It wouldn't be until 2016 that investigators would definitively link Brian and Katie Maggiore's deaths to the East Area Rapist. But in 1978, the connection was suspected, and Sacramento descended into absolute panic. If he was willing to kill a couple out for a walk, he was willing to kill anyone. The man who had terrorized women for 2 years, who had invaded homes with surgical precision, who had psychologically tortured families, was now a murderer. But as quickly as the terror began in Sacramento, it stopped. By June 1978, the East Area Rapist had moved on. Attacks began occurring in Contra Costa County, in Concord, in San Ramon, in Walnut Creek. The predator was expanding his hunting ground, and the body count was about to rise. Coming up, Southern California. Couples found bludgeoned to death in their homes, and a decade-long investigation that would go cold, because the monster they were hunting had vanished. Or had he? October 1979, Goleta, California. A beachside community in Santa Barbara County, 300 miles south of Sacramento. The East Area Rapist had been quiet for months. Investigators in Northern California were hoping, praying, that he had stopped, that maybe he was in prison for something else, that maybe he had moved away. They were right about one thing: he had moved, but he hadn't stopped. October 1st, 1979. A couple in Goleta woke to a nightmare, an intruder standing over their bed. In the darkness, they could hear him muttering to himself, "I'll kill him, I'll kill him." He tied them with twine, bound them. When he left the room, the woman screamed, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, loud enough to trigger an alarm. The killer fled on a stolen bicycle, abandoning it just blocks away along with a knife. An FBI agent who lived next door gave chase, but the predator vanished into the backyards and alleyways, disappearing like smoke. It was the first attack in Southern California, and it was the only one where both victims survived. 2 months later, on December 30th, 1979, the killer returned to Goleta. This time, there would be no survivors. Dr. Robert Offerman, 44, was an osteopathic doctor. Deborah Manning, 35, was a clinical psychologist. They were staying at Offerman's condominium near the beach when the intruder broke in through a sliding glass door around 3 a.m. Offerman and Manning were found shot dead. Both had been bound, both executed with a fireplace poker found at the scene. The killer had broken into an adjoining residence earlier and stolen a bicycle, which was later found abandoned blocks away. Paw prints from a large dog were discovered at the scene, suggesting the killer may have brought an animal with him. These were the first confirmed murders in Southern California, and they marked a terrifying evolution. The East Area Rapist was now the original Night Stalker. For the next 7 years, from 1979 to 1986, he would kill at least 10 more people across Southern California: Santa Barbara County, Ventura County, Orange County, Irvine. His victims were always couples or women alone. His method was always the same: break in while they slept, bind them, and then bludgeon them to death. March 13, 1980, Ventura County. Lyman Smith, 43, was about to be appointed a Ventura County Superior Court judge. His wife, Charlene, 33, was a court clerk and interior decorator. They were bludgeoned to death with a fireplace log while they slept in their bed. Charlene was raped before she was killed. Some of her jewelry was stolen. 2 days later, their 12-year-old son found their bodies. For 16 years, investigators suspected Charlene's lover, then a business associate of Lyman's. One man was even arrested and charged with their murders after a minister claimed he had confessed. Eventually, DNA evidence cleared him. The case went cold. But there was one detail that haunted investigators: the way their hands were bound, the shoelaces, the precision, the method. It was too similar to other unsolved murders. Murders in Orange County, murders in Santa Barbara. In 2001, DNA testing would definitively link the Smith murders to the original Night Stalker and the East Area Rapist, proving that they were all committed by the same person. But in 1980, all investigators knew was that someone was hunting couples across Southern California, and he wasn't finished. August 19, 1980. Dana Point, California, the gated community of Niguel Shores, a single-story home on Cockleshell Drive. Keith Harrington was 24 years old, a fourth-year medical school student. Patrice Harrington was 28, a pediatric trauma nurse. They had been married for only 3 months. They had just moved into their new home, owned by Keith's father, starting their lives together, planning their future. The killer entered their residence just after 11 p.m. through an unlocked door. He tied them up, raped Patrice, then covered both of them with bedding and bludgeoned them to death. 2 days later, on August 21st, Keith's father, Roger, went to check on the newlyweds. He found them in their bed, blood spattered, ligature marks on their wrists and Patrice's ankles. The bindings still on the bed. Keith's brother, Bruce Harrington, would later say that discovering his brother's murder was the worst moment of his life, but he would turn that grief into action. For the next 24 years, Bruce Harrington would fight. He would campaign. He would lobby legislators. He would fund research. All to change California's DNA laws. All to make sure that one day, somehow, his brother's killer would be caught. He couldn't have known that his work would be the very thing that would eventually lead investigators to Joseph DeAngelo. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. February 6, 1981. Irvine, California. Manuela Withen, 28 years old, was alone in her home. Her husband, David, was in the hospital due to an illness. Between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., the killer broke in. Manuela was attacked and beaten. The cause of death was skull fractures. Her parents discovered her body in a sleeping bag when they went to check on her. There was no murder weapon found at the scene, no ligatures, but Manuela's body had signs of being tied before she was bludgeoned. And there was DNA, semen, evidence that would sit in storage for years, waiting for technology to catch up. But what happened next would haunt David Withen for the rest of his life. The killer continued to stalk him. Phone calls came to the house after Manuela's murder, taunting, threatening, and because investigators had no leads, police and neighbors began to suspect David himself. Suspicion heightened when David married a sympathetic co-worker named Rhonda not long after the murder. David became an alcoholic. His second marriage ended after nearly a decade when Rhonda divorced him. For years, David Withen lived under the shadow of suspicion for a crime he didn't commit. Years later, he was exonerated by DNA testing. He died in 2008, 10 years before his wife's real killer was finally caught. David Withen never got to see justice for Manuela, never got to look her killer in the eye, never got to hear him confess. He died believing the world thought he was a monster. July 27, 1981. Back to Goleta. Gregory Sanchez, 27, and Sherry Domingo, 35, were found bludgeoned to death in their home. The killer raped Domingo before murdering both victims. Both were bound, both beaten with such force that their skulls were fractured. And then, silence. For 5 years, the original Night Stalker went dormant. No attacks, no murders, no rapes. Investigators theorized he might have been incarcerated for another crime, or moved out of state, or died. Some believed he had simply stopped. But in reality, Joseph DeAngelo had been living quietly in Citrus Heights, just miles from where he'd terrorized families as the East Area Rapist. He had been fired from his job as a police officer in Auburn in 1979 for shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer from a convenience store. He moved to Citrus Heights in 1980, where he would live until his arrest 38 years later. He worked as a mechanic at a Save Mart supermarket distribution center. He had a wife. He had 3 daughters. He had neighbors who described him as cranky but harmless. An old man who yelled at kids who came too close to his property. No one suspected him. No one knew him. No one could imagine what he had done. Until May 1986, when he killed one more time. May 4th, 1986, Irvine, California. Janelle Cruz, 18 years old, was home alone. Her parents had gone out for the evening. The killer broke in. He raped her, then he murdered her. Janelle was found the next morning, bludgeoned to death, another young life stolen, another family destroyed. And then the Golden State Killer disappeared. For 32 years, no more attacks, no more murders, no more taunting phone calls. He simply vanished. Back in Northern California, investigators were overwhelmed. Hundreds of suspects, thousands of leads. DNA evidence that didn't match anyone in any database. The East Area Rapist Task Force had files stacked floor to ceiling, composite sketches plastered on walls, maps with pins marking attack locations, phone records, victim statements, evidence bags containing shoelaces, bindings, DNA samples, but no suspect. In Southern California, it was the same story. The original Night Stalker cases were ice cold. Detectives like Larry Poole in Orange County refused to give up, but they had nothing. Poole had taken up the case in 1997 when he was assigned to the department's unsolved homicide team. In 1996, DNA evidence had linked the Harrington murders to the Irvine killings. Investigators knew they were looking for one killer, but they didn't know who. Then in 2001, everything changed. DNA testing indicated that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. The crimes that had terrorized Northern California in the late 70s were connected to the murders that had terrorized Southern California in the early 80s. One predator, over 100 burglaries, at least 50 rapes, 13 murders, spanning from 1974 to 1986. 11 counties, 300 miles. The scope was staggering. The brutality was unprecedented, and the suspect was nowhere. But there was one person who refused to let the case die. A woman who didn't know any of the victims. A writer who lived in Los Angeles and became obsessed with finding the truth. Her name was Michelle McNamara, and she would give the killer his most famous name. Michelle McNamara was a true crime writer and blogger. She ran a website called True Crime Diary, and in 2013, she started investigating the East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker case. She pored over police files. She interviewed victims. She spoke with investigators. She connected with online communities of amateur sleuths who were also trying to solve the case. And she came up with a new name for the killer. A name that would capture the public's attention like never before. The Golden State Killer. Because he had terrorized the entire state of California, from north to south, for over a decade, and no one could catch him. McNamara wrote a book about her investigation. She titled it I'll Be Gone in the Dark, a reference to what the killer had told one of his victims. A promise. A threat. I'll be gone in the dark. But Michelle McNamara never finished her book. On April 21, 2016, she died in her sleep at the age of 46, an undiagnosed heart condition exacerbated by prescription medication. Her husband, comedian Patton Oswalt, worked with researchers to complete the manuscript. I'll Be Gone in the Dark was published on February 27, 2018. 2 months later, Joseph DeAngelo was arrested. Michelle McNamara never got to see the Golden State Killer caught, but her work, her obsession, her determination to shine a light on these cold cases helped keep public attention focused on the investigation. And by 2016, investigators had a new tool, something that didn't exist in the 70s or 80s, something revolutionary: genetic genealogy. The ability to trace family trees through DNA, to find distant cousins through public databases, to connect the dots between a crime scene sample and a living, breathing human being. In June 2016, the FBI and local law enforcement agencies held a news conference to announce a renewed nationwide effort to catch the Golden State Killer, offering a $50,000 reward. They had DNA. They had evidence. They had decades of files and testimony and victim statements. What they needed was a match, a name, a face, and they were about to get one. Coming up, a genealogist, a public database, and a digital family tree that would lead investigators to a 72-year-old man living in a quiet suburb, the same suburb where he'd once prowled as the East Area Rapist. The case that had gone cold for 40 years was about to be solved in a way no one had ever imagined. March 2017. Paul Holes, a forensic investigator with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, had been working the Golden State Killer case for 22 years. He was scheduled to retire in 1 year, and he knew he was running out of time. For decades, Holes had carried the weight of unsolved murders. The faces of victims haunted him. Keith and Patrice Harrington, Manuela Withun, Gregory Sanchez and Sherry Domingo. 12 families without justice, 50 rape victims without closure. He had DNA, he had evidence. He had crime scene samples preserved in freezers since the 1970s and 80s. But he had no match in any criminal database. No hit in CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. No name, no face. The killer had vanished like a ghost. But Holes had heard whispers about a new technique, something that was being used to solve adoption cases, to reunite families, to identify unknown victims. Genetic genealogy. In 2015, a woman named Barbara Ray Venter had done the impossible. She'd used DNA in publicly available genealogy websites to identify the biological family of a woman who had been abducted as a child, a woman who had no idea who she really was. And in the process, Ray Venter had helped solve a series of murders in New Hampshire known as the Bear Brook murders. She'd identified victims. She'd identified a killer, all from DNA uploaded to a genealogy website. Paul Holes read about her work, and he realized something profound. If this technique could identify an unknown victim, could it identify an unknown killer? In March 2017, Holes reached out to Barbara Ray Venter. Barbara Ray Venter was 70 years old, a retired patent attorney, a PhD in biology, a grandmother living in Monterey County, California, with her cats in her garden. She had spent her career specializing in biotechnology patents. She understood DNA. She understood genetics. And when she retired, she'd turned to genealogy as a hobby, helping adoptees find their birth families, building family trees, connecting people to their roots. She had what she called a grasshopper mind, the ability to circle a problem, to come at it from odd angles, to see connections others couldn't see. And when Paul Holes called her, when he told her about the Golden State Killer, when he explained that they had DNA but no suspect, she said something that would change everything. "I can help you." But there was a problem. A massive problem. Traditional law enforcement DNA profiles, the kind stored in CODIS, analyze about 20 locations on the genome. 20 markers. That's it. Genetic genealogy profiles, the kind used by consumer DNA testing companies like 23andMe and Ancestry, analyze about 700,000 locations, 700,000 data points. They're 35,000 times more detailed than law enforcement profiles. And every DNA sample from the Golden State Killer crime scenes had already been tested, used up, consumed by decades of attempts to match it to criminal databases. There was nothing left, except one sample, one preserved semen sample from a Southern California crime scene, stored in a freezer for decades. In February 2018, FBI lawyer Steve Kramer and a small team of investigators worked with a lab to create a genetic genealogy profile from that sample. The DNA was in excellent condition. The lab analysis was successful. Now they had a profile, 700,000 data points, a genetic blueprint. But where would they upload it? Most commercial DNA companies refused to work with law enforcement. Steve Kramer approached all of them. Only one agreed to help, Family Tree DNA, but the CEO, Bennett Greenspan, asked that his company's involvement be kept secret. So Ray Venter and her team turned to another option, a free public website called GED Match. GED Match was created in 2010 by two genealogy enthusiasts, Curtis Rogers and John Olson. It was an obscure site, a tool for hobbyists, people who wanted to expand their family trees by comparing DNA with others. The site allowed users to upload raw DNA data from consumer testing companies and search for genetic relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, distant connections. It had no idea it was about to become the most important crime-fighting tool in modern history. In February 2018, Barbara Ray Venter uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GED Match under a pseudonym. And then she waited. The GED Match search yielded over 1,000 genetic cousins, distant relatives, people who shared small segments of DNA with the killer, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who had no idea they were related to a monster. Ray Venter began building family trees, massive family trees, working backwards from these distant cousins to find common ancestors, then working forward through generations to identify all living descendants. It was painstaking work, hours upon hours of research, birth certificates, marriage records, obituaries, census data, newspaper archives, death records. She used databases like findagrave.com, ancestry.com, public records, anything she could find. For 4.5 months, Ray Ventura and Paul Holes worked together, building trees, eliminating branches, crossing off females, crossing off anyone who didn't match the age, location, and physical description of the Golden State Killer. Ray Ventura discovered something crucial from the DNA. The killer was likely of Italian heritage. He might be prematurely bald. She cross-referenced this with old newspaper articles about the East Area Rapist, articles that suggested the killer might have been in law enforcement or the military. He knew police procedures. He knew how to avoid capture. He moved like someone with training. Eventually, they narrowed it down to 6 possible suspects. 6 men who fit the profile. 6 men living in California. 6 men of the right age. Paul Holes called the California DMV. He asked for driver's license information on all 6 men. Only one had blue eyes. Joseph James DeAngelo, born November 8, 1945, 72 years old. Address 8316 Canyon Oak Drive, Citrus Heights, California. The same neighborhood where the Golden State Killer had raped his first known victim in June 1976. 42 years earlier. He had been living there for decades, in plain sight, miles from where he'd terrorized families. Working as a mechanic at a Save Mart distribution center in Roseville, retired in 2017, a grandfather, a neighbor, unremarkable. Except for his anger. Neighbors described him as cranky, quick to rage. He yelled at kids who came near his property. He screamed at waitresses who made mistakes. One cafe owner called him Mr. Angry because of his reactions to small errors. But no one suspected him. No one imagined what he'd done. Paul Holes began surveillance. Just weeks before his retirement, he sat in his car outside DeAngelo's house, watching, waiting, trying to decide what to do. He needed confirmation. He needed DeAngelo's DNA to compare it to the crime scene samples. So they waited for him to discard something, anything. Detectives followed him, to stores, to restaurants, anywhere he might leave behind a cup, a napkin, a straw. And then they got it. A tissue discarded at a Hobby Lobby, DNA extracted from the tissue, sent to the lab. It was a match. After 44 years, they had their man. April 24th, 2018, National DNA Day. The irony was not lost on investigators. Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies surrounded DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights. He was alone. His family was away. Around 4 p.m., DeAngelo stepped into his side yard, wearing a t-shirt, cargo shorts, and tube socks. Deputies moved in. DeAngelo looked shocked, stunned, his eyes wide. He offered no resistance. But he protested in a high-pitched voice. "I have a roast in the oven." Officers told him they'd take care of it. They placed him in handcuffs, read him his rights, and took him to the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department. The Golden State Killer, the predator who had terrorized an entire state for over a decade, who had raped 50 women, who had murdered 13 people, who had vanished for 32 years, had been caught by a retired patent attorney with a hobby in genealogy and a free website designed to help people find their cousins. At the sheriff's department, DeAngelo was placed in an interrogation room. Cold, bare, fluorescent lights. He slumped into a plastic chair. And for nearly 2 hours, alone, thinking the cameras were off, he stared at the walls, drawing in large gulps of air, muttering to himself. I didn't have the strength to push him out. He made me. He went with me. It was like in my head. I mean, he's a part of me. I didn't want to do those things. I pushed Jerry out and had a happy life. Jerry, an alter ego, a scapegoat, a way to disassociate from the horror he'd inflicted. But investigators weren't buying it, and neither would the courts. On April 25, 2018, law enforcement held a press conference. Sacramento District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert stood at a podium, flanked by investigators from across California. Behind her, a wall of photos, victims, crime scenes, evidence. She announced the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, 72 years old, former police officer, charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. Soon, more charges would follow. 13 murders total, 13 kidnapping counts, charges spanning 6 California counties. Bruce Harrington, whose brother Keith and sister-in-law Patrice had been murdered in 1980, stood at that press conference. The man who had spent decades lobbying for DNA legislation, the man who had never given up. He spoke directly to the other survivors. "We found him. To all the survivors, justice is coming." Barbara Ray Venter's name was not mentioned at first. Paul Holes kept her involvement secret for months, protecting her privacy, protecting her from the media storm. But eventually, he revealed her identity, and Barbara Ray Venter became famous overnight. In 2019, Time magazine named her one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Nature Journal included her in their list of 10 people who mattered in science. She had been approached to help with over 50 cold cases, murders, unidentified victims, rapes, all across the country. Genetic genealogy had changed everything. Since the Golden State Killer arrest, forensic genetic genealogy has been used to solve approximately 70 violent crimes. Cold cases that had been frozen for decades, families without answers, victims without names. The technique has identified serial killers, rapists, murderers who thought they'd gotten away with it. But it has also sparked intense debate, privacy concerns, ethical questions, constitutional issues. GED Match, the site that had helped solve the case, was caught in the crossfire. Genealogists divided between those who wanted to help law enforcement and those who believed the practice invaded users' genetic privacy. In 2019, GED Match was acquired by Verigan, a forensic genetics company. The site tightened its policies. Users now had to opt in to allow law enforcement access. The brief golden age of open access forensic genealogy was over, but the revolution it sparked continues. Michelle McNamara never got to see this moment. She died 2 years before DeAngelo's arrest. But her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, published just 2 months before he was caught, had kept the case alive, had kept pressure on investigators, had given the killer his most famous name, the Golden State Killer. And now he had a face, Joseph James DeAngelo. But the story wasn't over. The arrest was just the beginning. Now came the reckoning. Coming up, a courtroom, 150 victims and family members, 3 days of impact statements, and a 74-year-old man forced to hear, for the first time in his life, the consequences of what he'd done. The Golden State Killer was about to learn that he could no longer control the narrative, and the survivors were about to take back their power. June 29, 2020. Sacramento County Superior Court. Judge Michael Bowman's courtroom. 2 years after his arrest, Joseph James DeAngelo was finally going to face the consequences of his crimes. But COVID-19 had shut down most of the world. Courtrooms were limited. Social distancing was mandatory. So prosecutors made an unusual decision. They moved the proceedings to a university ballroom, the California State University Sacramento Alumni Center, a vast space large enough to hold 150 people, 6 feet apart. Victims, family members, survivors, prosecutors from 6 counties, all gathered to witness history. DeAngelo sat in a wheelchair, wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, a white face mask covering his mouth, his lawyers on either side. The wheelchair was a prop, prosecutors believed. Videos taken of DeAngelo in his jail cell showed him climbing onto his bunk, moving around freely, standing without assistance. But in court, he played the role of a feeble old man. Judge Bowman began reading the charges, all 26 of them: murder, kidnapping during robbery, rape during burglary, gun enhancements, knife enhancements. Count one.
Charge of murder of Claude Snelling. That count currently charges an open-ended murder. To the allegation that you willfully deliberately, and with premeditation, when you unlawfully and with malice aforethought murdered Claude Snelling, which occurred September 11th, 1975, in the county of Tulare, a violation of Penal Code Section 187, A, murder in the first degree. How do you plead?
Guilty.
There's also an allegation that you personally used a firearm in the course of that murder in violation of Penal Code Section 12022.5. Do you admit or deny?
Guilty.
You admit or deny, sir?
I admit.
Regarding the uncharged act of kidnapping with intent to commit rape of Elizabeth Snelling, having occurred on September 11th, 1975, in the county of Tulare, a violation of Penal Code Section 209, do you admit or deny?
I admit.
Thank you.
But the charges didn't stop there. As part of the plea agreement, DeAngelo also admitted to crimes for which the statute of limitations had expired. Crimes he could no longer be prosecuted for. 50 rapes, over 100 burglaries, attempted murders, kidnappings, false imprisonment, criminal threats. Prosecutors said DeAngelo admitted to harming 87 victims in 53 separate crimes spanning 11 California counties. The scope was staggering. The brutality was unprecedented. And now, for the first time in his life, Joseph James DeAngelo was going to hear what he'd done from the people he'd destroyed. The plea deal spared DeAngelo the death penalty. In exchange, he agreed to plead guilty to all charges. He waived all appellate rights. He would never be able to challenge his conviction, never be able to appeal his sentence. And he agreed to something else, something that would prove to be the most powerful part of the proceedings. He agreed to sit in that courtroom and listen to every victim, to every family member, to every word. For 3 days. August 18th, 2020. The victim impact statements began. 150 people packed into that ballroom, some in their 20s, some in their 70s, some in their 80s and 90s. Cancer survivors, people who had driven across the state, people who had waited 40 years for this moment. And DeAngelo had to sit there, silent, listening. Phyllis Henneman was the first known victim of the East Area Rapist, attacked in June 1976 when she was 22 years old. Her mother had died just 18 months earlier. She was alone in her Sacramento home when he broke in. Her sister, Karen Villieu, read her statement. Joseph DeAngelo, henceforth called the Devil Incarnate, broke into my home, blindfolded me, tied me up, threatened my life with a knife, and raped me. Life as I knew it irrevocably changed that day. For 44 years, Phyllis had lived in fear, afraid of phone calls, afraid of the dark, afraid of being alone. Her health suffered, her sense of self-worth shattered. But now, she said, with DeAngelo's arrest and sentencing, his victims and their families are now free. Patricia Murphy's daughter, Patty Cosper, gave DeAngelo an obscene gesture as she approached the microphone. Her mother had been attacked, raped for 2 hours, terrorized in her own home. Reading her mother's statement, Cosper's voice broke with rage and pain.
He shook me until it soon became clear that he and his knife had complete control over me for the next 2 hours. It is my hope that you punish him to the full extent of the law for the horrific crimes he committed. He admitted that he caused all the suffering and misery to so many victims over the past 40 plus years. He truly is an evil monster with no soul.
He and his knife had complete control over me for the next 2 hours. He truly is an evil monster with no soul. Victim after victim came forward. Women who had been raped, men who had been tied up and forced to listen to their wives' screams, children who had been in the house while their mothers were assaulted. Chris Pedretti, who was 15 when DeAngelo attacked her in 1976. The girl he'd told would be gone in the dark. Gay and Bob Hardwick, a couple attacked in 1978. Bob had been tied up with dishes stacked on his back while DeAngelo raped his wife in another room. Jane Carson Sandler, raped in 1976 while her son slept down the hall. Some victims were too old to attend. Some had died waiting for this day. Their statements were read by family members, their faces shown on screens. And DeAngelo sat there, expressionless, staring ahead. Day 2, August 19th, the families of murder victims took the stand. Ron Harrington, whose brother Keith and sister-in-law Patrice were murdered just 3 months after their wedding in 1980. Debbie McMullen, whose mother Sherry Domingo was raped and beaten to death when Debbie was 15 years old. As she began speaking, McMullen said, "My heart is racing." She described how her mother's murder sent her spiraling into depression and drug addiction. "A decade was lost," she said. "Mom would have helped. She would have supported me and guided me toward the solutions." Michelle Cruz spoke for her sister Janelle, the 18-year-old girl murdered in her bedroom in 1986, the last victim. Michelle Cruz asked the court,
"I wonder if he remembers the details. I wonder if he remembers Janelle, my sister, fighting him off. She was fighting for her life. My question is why? Why? I wonder why Janelle. I wonder what made him plan and deliberately torture her. She was only 18 years old, and she had a bright future ahead of her. My sister had a lot of hard times growing up, but she was finally on a good path. She had dreams of going to college, living in her first apartment, getting married, having children, and so many more things. Joseph DeAngelo took all that away from Janelle the night he brutally raped and murdered her. Not only did he take all that away from her, but he also took dreams away from me and my mom. My 5-year-old brother never got the chance to grow up with his big sister. But during the next 32 years, Joseph DeAngelo got married, raised his children, bought a home, went on vacations, and became a grandfather. He basically had a good, full life. On the other hand, I will never be an aunt. My kids will never have cousins. My mom will never see her daughter go to college or get married. Joseph DeAngelo took everything from us. He's a selfish, sadistic, calculating, cruel, pathetic piece of scum. What he did to my sister on May 5th, 1986 was more than evil. He brutally beat my sister beyond recognition. And because of this, she had a closed casket funeral.
I wonder if he remembers the details. I wonder if he remembers Janelle, my sister, fighting him off. Janelle was beaten beyond recognition and needed a closed casket funeral. My sister had a lot of hard times growing up, but she was finally on a good path. She had dreams of going to college, living in her first apartment, getting married, having children. Meanwhile, DeAngelo had lived a full life, a wife, children, grandchildren, a home, decades of freedom while Janelle lay in a grave. Lyman Smith's son, who was 12 years old when he found his father and stepmother bludgeoned to death, described the horror of that day, the blood, the bodies, the trauma that shaped every moment of his life afterward. The family of Manuela Witten spoke about the suspicion that fell on her husband David, how he was destroyed by grief and accusation, how he drank himself into oblivion, how he died in 2008, never knowing his wife's killer would be caught. And then there was Sharon Huddle, DeAngelo's ex-wife. They had been married in 1973, divorced in 1991. She had 3 daughters with him. She submitted a written statement to the court. It was not read aloud, but it was made public. Sharon Huddle never once referred to DeAngelo by name. She called him the defendant throughout. She wrote that his actions have had a devastating and pervasive effect on her life. I will never be the same person. I now live every day with the knowledge of how he attacked and severely damaged hundreds of innocent people's lives and murdered 13 innocent people who were loved and have now been missed for 40 years or more. For 3 days, DeAngelo sat there, listening, watching, as person after person described the hell he'd put them through. And he showed nothing. No emotion, no remorse, no reaction. Until the very end. August 21st, 2020, sentencing day. Judge Michael Bowman addressed the court. His voice was measured, firm. He had listened to 3 days of testimony, 3 days of pain, 3 days of horror. And now he had something to say.
With respect to the approval of this disposition, the court approves of this plea. I have considered the comments of counsel, the facts in this case, as well as the overall circumstances of this disposition. I've considered the defendant's age, the fact there are inmates currently on death row and have been so for 30 years. I have considered the fact that there is currently a moratorium on the death penalty in California. Furthermore, this disposition does give survivors and their loved ones an opportunity to have their words heard, not to endure the unimaginable emotions that they would experience by sitting through such a trial. Finally, with this resolution, the California taxpayers have been saved tens of millions of dollars. For the reasons stated, the court approves of this plea. However, the court is not saying that Mr. DeAngelo does not deserve to have the death penalty imposed. It merely means the court feels it would never come to pass. In truth, all the parties should be commended in reaching this resolution, for the result of this trial and a plea of guilty is the same. Mr. DeAngelo will spend the rest of his natural life and ultimately meet his death confined behind the walls of a state penitentiary. I generally don't make comments at sentencing, but I am going to make an exception. Having approved of this plea, I will now move on to the imposition of sentence. Mr. DeAngelo, I've listened for the last 3 days from the people you've terrorized and their friends and their family. Their impact statement will always be with me. I was moved by their courage, their grace, their strength, all qualities you clearly lack. I know whatever words I say today will pale in comparison to the words the survivors have spoken. They need to be said. The fundamental principle of law that justice delayed is justice denied is no truer than in this case. But for the dogged persistence and perseverance of law enforcement, their survivors, their families, and citizen detectives, this case may have remained unsolved. There are many heroes like Carol Daly, Paul Holes, Michelle McNamara, and many heroes that I don't even know that brought this day here. And I have little doubt, but for the tenacity and unwavering quest for justice exhibited by Sacramento District Attorney's Office, Emery Schubert, you may have escaped earthly justice altogether. If I listened to the survivors and I've watched you, I could not help but wondering, what are you thinking? Are you capable of comprehending the pain and anguish you have caused? It is my sincere hope that with the opportunity to be heard these last few days and the sentence to be imposed, the survivors will find some resolution, find some peace, and hopefully find some justice, however imperfect. Mr. DeAngelo, I sentence you to the following. Count 1, the charge of murder in the first degree of Claude Snelling, a violation of Penal Code Section 187. The court hereby sentences the defendant to imprisonment for life.
Mr. DeAngelo, I've listened to the last 3 days from the people you terrorized and their friends and their family. Their impact statements will always be with me. I was moved by their courage, their grace, their strength, all qualities you clearly lack. As I listened to the survivors and I watched you, I could not help but wonder, what are you thinking? Are you capable of comprehending the pain and anguish you have caused? Judge Bowman explained the plea deal. He said, the court approves this plea. However, the court is not saying that Mr. DeAngelo does not deserve to have the death penalty imposed. It merely means the court feels it will never come to pass. In truth, all the parties should be commended in reaching this resolution because the result of this trial and a plea of guilty is the same. Mr. DeAngelo will spend the rest of his natural life and ultimately meet his death confined behind the walls of a state penitentiary. California had a moratorium on executions. DeAngelo was 74 years old. His victims were in their 80s and 90s. Some had died waiting for this day. Some had cancer. Some couldn't travel. A trial would have taken years. Appeals could have dragged on for decades, and DeAngelo might have died before ever facing justice. This plea deal guaranteed he would die in prison. No appeals, no second chances, no possibility of parole. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer said, "I honestly believe that this person, not even a person, this beast deserved the ultimate punishment of death. But we met with our victims. We knew the age of the case. We knew how long it took to solve, and we knew that this was the right thing to do." And then something unexpected happened. Joseph DeAngelo stood up. He rose from his wheelchair. The wheelchair prosecutors believed was a prop. He removed his white face mask, and for the first time in 3 days, he spoke.
"I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've heard. Thank you, Your Honor."
Thank you, sir.
"I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I have hurt. Thank you, Your Honor." 23 words. That's all he said. 23 words to account for 44 years of terror, 87 victims, 13 murders, 50 rapes, over 100 burglaries. 23 words. Some victims believed him. Some thought it was one last manipulation, one last performance from a man who had spent his entire life lying. But it didn't matter, because the sentence was final. Judge Bowman sentenced Joseph James DeAngelo to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional life sentence and another 8 years. He would never walk free again. He would die in prison, behind walls, in a cell. The Golden State Killer was gone in the dark. Forever. As DeAngelo was wheeled out of the courtroom, victims and family members applauded. Some cried. Some embraced. Some simply sat in silence, processing 40 years of trauma finally coming to an end. Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert said, "My greatest hope for all of these victims and their families, perhaps, is best put in their own words, as we heard this week. They had taken back their power. They had told their stories. They had looked their monster in the eye. And they had won." After the sentencing, Anne Marie Schubert released 3 videos. Surveillance footage from DeAngelo's jail cell. The footage showed him climbing onto his bunk, standing, moving freely, stretching, doing push-ups against the wall. The wheelchair was a lie. The frailty was an act. To the very end, Joseph DeAngelo was still playing games. Schubert said,
"These are just snippets into the window of the mind of a sociopath. He is, quite simply, the definition of one. He has and always will be a sociopath in action. Today, the world knows that."
These are just snippets into the window of a mind of a sociopath. He has and always will be a sociopath in action. Joseph James DeAngelo is currently incarcerated at California State Prison, Corcoran. He's in protective custody, isolated from the general prison population. He'll spend the rest of his life in a cell, alone, forgotten. He's 79 years old now. He'll likely die there. And when he does, the world will barely notice. But this case changed everything. Since DeAngelo's arrest in 2018, forensic genetic genealogy has been used to solve approximately 70 violent cold cases across the United States. The 1987 murder of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg in Washington State, solved in 2018. The 1992 murder of Christy Marack in Pennsylvania, solved in 2018. The 1980 murder of Helene Przinski in Colorado, solved in 2019. The 1988 murder of April Tinsley, an 8-year-old girl in Indiana, solved in 2018. Killers who thought they'd gotten away with it. Rapists who believed they were untouchable. All caught because of a technique pioneered by a 70-year-old retired patent attorney in a database created by genealogy hobbyists. Barbara Ray Venter continues her work. She's consulted on over 50 cold cases. She's identified unknown victims. She's given families closure. Paul Holes retired from law enforcement in 2018, the same year DeAngelo was arrested. He now works as a consultant and podcaster, helping solve cold cases and educating the public about forensic science. The survivors continue to heal. Some have written books. Some have become advocates for victims' rights. Some have simply tried to reclaim their lives. Bruce Harrington, whose brother Keith and sister-in-law Patrice were murdered in 1980, has become a spokesperson for DNA legislation. His advocacy in the mid-1990s helped expand California's DNA database. That database, combined with genetic genealogy, caught his brother's killer. He turned his grief into action, and that action changed history. But not everyone lived to see justice. Michelle McNamara died in 2016. She never saw DeAngelo arrested, never saw her book become a bestseller, never saw the man she called the Golden State Killer finally unmasked. David Whitten died in 2008. He never knew who killed his wife Manuela, never got to see DeAngelo convicted, never got his name cleared. Dozens of victims died waiting. Some in the 1990s, some in the 2000s, some just months before the arrest. They fought for justice. They carried trauma for decades. They never gave up hope. And they died without answers. For them, for all the victims who didn't live to see this day, the survivors spoke. They carried their stories into that courtroom. They made sure their names were remembered. Because that's what justice is. Not just punishment, but remembrance, acknowledgement, truth. The Golden State Killer terrorized California for over a decade. He committed unspeakable crimes. He destroyed hundreds of lives. But he didn't win. Because in the end, science caught him, genealogy exposed him, and the survivors outlasted him. He's in prison. They're free. He's forgotten. They're remembered. He'll die in a cell. They'll die surrounded by people who love them. This case changed everything. It changed how law enforcement investigates cold cases. It changed how we think about DNA. It changed what's possible. But more than that, it showed that time doesn't erase crimes. That justice, even delayed by decades, can still arrive. That monsters can't hide forever. And it showed the power of persistence, of survivors who refused to be silenced, of investigators who never gave up, of a retired patent attorney who saw a problem and decided to solve it. The Golden State Killer thought he was untouchable, thought he was invisible, thought he was gone in the dark. But the light found him anyway. And in that light, we see not just a killer brought to justice, but a new era of forensic science, an era where cold cases aren't hopeless, where victims can get answers, where families can find closure. One case changed everything, and that case was the Golden State Killer. If you believe no victim should be forgotten and no killer should sleep soundly, subscribe to Criminal Minds Archives, because justice delayed is not justice denied, and we're here to prove it, one cold case at a time. Drop a comment, hit that like button, turn on notifications, because somewhere another family is waiting for answers, and we'll be there to tell their story. Joseph James DeAngelo is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole at California State Prison. Corcoran, he will never be released. Forensic genetic genealogy continues to solve cold cases across the United States. If you or someone you know needs help, please contact National Sexual Assault Hotline, 1-800-656-4673. RAIN online chat, online.rain.org.